Okay, I'm going to get started. My name is Scott Leopold of Cooperative Strategies. I'm the Executive Director of Planning, and this is our fourth webinar. This is about community engagement from a distance. I think this is a particularly relevant subject right now because even though we are pretty much shut down across the country, we do have to kind of maintain a lot of our efforts that do require community engagement. This is something that we've been able to do kind of at a distance and virtually long before we had to go through this. And I just kind of wanted to share some best practices, lessons learned, and then just kind of open it up for discussion about maybe what some of you all are doing to still engage your communities at this time. Just protocol, feel free to turn your camera on or off. Please use the chat function for any questions. We'll try to get those questions answered between the slides. Karen Daniel Hamburg is kind of my co-host here. She's going to kind of be driving everything as far as Zoom goes. And if she can answer a question about anything that you may submit, she'll try to answer it. We are recording the meeting, so if you don't want to have your name or face show up, you can just turn your camera off or change or delete your name now. But we will be focusing on the slide content and not the images. Just our agenda, we're looking at what are some promising observations that we've observed over the last few weeks, best practices, lessons learned, open discussion and sharing, and then moving forward, creating a back to school survey. So we'll record this meeting and take notes, and we'll distribute to everybody who registered. Again, we've had a few other webinars in the past few weeks, so feel free to watch those. They're on our YouTube channel, and we'll have a landing page on our website here pretty soon. The topics that we've had before, we had Now What, Navigating K-12 Funding, Requests and Reopenings, weekly series, that's still ongoing. Reality is Virtual, Perspectives on Remote Learning from across the country. We had a couple students kind of share their perspectives in that one. And then The Perfect Storm, Guiding Schools Through Financial Turmoil. And so those are some previous episodes that we've had. Just some promising observations over the last few weeks. One thing that has kind of been evident to me is that many individuals who have resisted or struggled with online platforms historically are transitioning well. I think it's been a great experience, and people are really learning to engage in this medium. Attendance, steering committees, and other virtual meetings have even been better than in-person and online meetings were before this all happened. And so we're seeing 80–90% engagement when we have these virtual meetings and steering committees, when we might have seen 50 or 60% before. And I also think that virtual engagement is becoming much more acceptable and is probably here to stay. I think the days of traveling 8 hours on a plane for a 1-hour board meeting or presentation are probably gone. Just some best practices. We've kind of broken things up into two different means of engagement. So passive engagement would be kind of our traditional online surveys, and I'll go into more detail here in the following slides. And then active engagement. So this would be an example of active engagement as soon as we start talking and conversing. Online platforms, there's kind of two different methods to deliver those platforms. There's meetings and then webinar. We're kind of forcing a webinar content right now on a meeting platform, but there is a webinar version of this as well. And I'll kind of go through those differences here. And also how we run committee or community meetings and focus groups, and then large community meetings. We've also looked at a combination that I'll kind of detail later in this presentation that's been proven to be successful, and that's kind of leveraging online surveys with embedded multimedia, so videos embedded throughout the survey. And then at the end of the survey, we have an optional invitation for the participant to kind of sign up to participate in a series of focus group sessions to kind of get that back and forth between other community members and some conversation going. This may be review for a lot of you, but this is just kind of some benefits and limitations of some of our platforms. So with traditional online surveys, just some examples that you may be familiar with, SurveyMonkey, Google Forms, Thought Exchange. Benefits, participants can kind of complete these on their own schedule. So they don't have to time everything up and schedule everything out to sit through a meeting. They can just go through things at their leisure. It's great for collecting quantitative and qualitative responses, so we can get level of support, and we can also ask some open-ended questions that we can then analyze and tag. These platforms are also getting very sophisticated. They're allowing embedded video, so you can basically export slides out of a PowerPoint with a narration and embed them right into the video, so that as somebody is filling out a survey, they can view the appropriate content right then and there instead of having to find another link to a PDF. We can make them real easy to take. Just some limitations that we have with these traditional surveys. Long or complex surveys tend to have low completion rates. So if you have a very complex survey that has 30 or 40 questions, like nobody really wants to sit through a survey for an hour. They don't foster a robust two-way conversation. The exception there would be thought exchange. Thought exchange does allow people to post a question and have other people react to it. And it may be difficult to engage individuals who do not follow the district closely. And so getting access to these surveys, the medium is very easy to access. You can, take a survey on your phone, but just getting access to the medium can be difficult. Publicizing the surveys, just some tips that we found, some ways to get the word out that you have a survey, district website, of course, pushing things out on school messenger, building marquees. A lot of schools have digital marquees. Those are a way to reach people that may not necessarily ever visit your website. They may drive by and see it and be enticed by a message on there and want to go share their opinion on a survey. At this time, it's also very important to leverage other community organizations to get people engaged. Urban League, churches, NAACP, Kiwanis, YMCA, everybody's kind of going through this together as far as struggling with community engagement. So leveraging what other organizations are doing is also key. But the big piece here, keep surveys short and to the point. If you can make it a 5 or 10 minute survey with a few key questions that have a good focus, you're more likely to have a good turnout. The online platforms, again, I'm sure people are getting much more familiar with these. Just some examples: WebEx, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Adobe Connect. They're readily accessible. The general public is getting more comfortable using these every day. I don't see an age barrier to these like we may have seen in the past. We're seeing people of all ages able to access these platforms and use them well. There is some embedded polling functionality, and some platforms do allow for some breakout rooms, which are effective for kind of group work and that kind of thing. Limitations to these: participants need to attend scheduled meetings, but meetings can be recorded so that people that could not attend in person can still stay engaged. There are some concerns about security in these meetings, but requiring registration as you set these up can help reduce that. Just some helpful hints that we have. The one thing that I found that is real key to this is having a producer or somebody that's going to basically sit and run all the technical aspects of the meeting. They can allow people to come in the meeting, they can mute them and unmute them, they can answer questions. That way that the presenter can focus on delivering the content. Also start the meeting by reviewing the protocol up front like we did with this meeting. So have people mute their cameras or unmute their cameras depending on what you're going to do. You also want to know when to use a meeting versus a webinar. Zoom does have both options. I believe WebEx does as well. Meetings are great for groups of up to about 15 people, but for anything larger, webinars tend to be easier to manage because you basically have panelists on a webinar that would have their camera active and microphone active, and then everybody else would be a participant. And like I said earlier, we've kind of taken the meeting platform and forced it into a webinar for this one. But if you're going to have a large community meeting, the webinar is definitely going to be the way that you want to go. As far as best practices go, this is just a little bit more detail. Many of you might kind of be familiar with the traditional community meeting format where you have kind of a 15 or 20-minute presentation of background information, where you might talk about the process and data related to that, whether you're doing planning or curriculum or whatever. Then you have a paper survey where you ask people to kind of share their opinion on paper for 10 or 15 minutes. And then you go into a small group consensus building exercise, and that might last between 45 and 60 minutes. The whole point of doing that is that gives you kind of two different mediums to evaluate at the end. You get the initial reaction from what somebody may think about a topic on an individual survey, and then you also get that small group consensus where they discuss it, and you can kind of compare those responses and see where people change their minds, what topics are more malleable than others. And then kind of as we conclude those in-person meetings, we would have that report out or that gallery walk. Well, in the age of social distancing, none of that is going to work because we can't have a large gathering. And so what we've tried to do is kind of leverage a couple of these different strategies together to get the same outcome at the end. And so we'd start this by having our initial content recorded in a video, and we would embed that video on that online survey. And then for a lot of the participants, they may not have the time or the interest to participate in further discussion. They've said their piece, they've filled out their survey, and they're good to go. But for those people that want to stay engaged and have some more in-depth discussion at the end of the survey, we basically have an invitation to participate in a focus group. And we'll kind of tabulate all those responses. We'll have some just time bands out there for people to say what their availability is, and then you can kind of schedule what those focus group times might look like and what those groups might look like. And you would limit those groups to maybe 10 or 15 people, period. And then you'd run multiple focus groups. You could have 4 or 5 or 6 of them. And then you would just have those discussions via Zoom like we're doing now. And you could kind of record that group consensus that you would get in that small group discussion in an in-person meeting. And this way you kind of get at the end of the day, you get that same response. You have the individual response for those that just took the survey and they were done. And then you can get that focus group response with the Zoom meetings to be able to have those 2 different mediums to compare. So just some lessons learned doing this for, again, the last couple months. Test and verify. I'm sure many of you have done this already. If you have multiple panelists, you'll want to schedule a test meeting just to make sure that they're all comfortable using the platform. They all have the drivers installed and any plugins that they need. You want to make sure that you set up all the features that you want to use in the meeting ahead of time. In a lot of cases, some of these platforms have these disabled. And so, in Zoom, if you want to use breakout rooms in a meeting, you have to have the breakout rooms enabled before you start the meeting. And so just make sure that you're familiar with your platform before you get started. Try to keep it short. Most people don't have time to take a 30-second or 30-question online survey or spend 2 hours in WebEx or Zoom. Zoom fatigue is a thing. You sit on these things for 3 and 4 hours a day, you feel like you've been working for 8 or 10. Again, establishing protocol at the beginning of the meeting, take breaks for questions, just consider when you want to use a meeting versus a webinar, have a producer, and making that registration mandatory. And so that was quick. I didn't want to bore you with a lot of content because I know a lot of you are kind of living this every day. But at this point, I just kind of want to open it up to questions and maybe some sharing about, what strategies or maybe some different platforms that you're using and what you found success with, so that everybody can get a sense of what everybody's doing. So if you want to turn your camera on, you can, or if you want to leave it off, raise your hand, put something in a chat, that's fine with me. Let's see what we got. Okay, one of the questions we have here, seeing a few of the participants on the chat, we might want to address tips for non-English speakers. Many of the survey platforms do have multilingual modules to them, where you can basically have one survey link that you can have present that content in multiple languages. I know SurveyMonkey has it. I'm sure some of the other platforms have it as well, but there is the ability to be able to deliver that content across different languages. Any other questions? Does anybody have anything they want to share for what they've used with community engagement? I can't be that engaging. Okay, Matthew, you have your hand raised. Karen, you want to unmute Matthew?
Yes, Scott, thank you for your work and your time today. And if advanced apologies if you've already addressed this, but there is an intentionality in our community to be inclusive for all parents, families, and students, including those families that may not yet have in the school system. And so I wondered a little bit about when we've already
Oh, Matthew, you're breaking up a little bit.
straightforward outreach. Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. I just wanted to see, trying to do community engagement where we're trying to do the interpersonal outreach, but on a digital platform, or to migrate them onto a digital platform. Thoughts on how to bridge the digital divide and outreach to families that maybe don't even have students in a system yet?
That's something that we ran across this issue even before COVID kind of hit. It is difficult to engage people that aren't enrolled in your schools. One of the questions that we always get is, what do we do about young parents? How do we get to them? It's engaging kind of those civic groups. Again, those marquees are helpful. I know that most schools have digital marquees. If you're trying to collect feedback and engage people, kind of posting any engagements that you currently have on those marquees, people can see them if they're walking by or driving by. The other thing I think that is good to utilize is if there's a network of private daycares or any franchises or chains, trying to push information out to them so they can share it with their parents, with students that may not be in the system yet. As far as branching that kind of digital divide, that's a tough one. Many school systems aren't digital one-to-one yet. Many other school systems in this point in time, they have kind of gone on these Chromebook distribution waves, and so people are trying to distribute Chromebooks to their families that may not have a computer at home, or iPads, or whatever the device may be, but trying to leverage those platforms to get people engaged outside of just the curriculum where the students are completing it on those devices. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and it's a big question.
Yeah.
It's appreciation for your work,
Mm-hmm.
sharing perspectives. I think especially the folks that don't have students yet. I appreciate that idea of the network of daycares. That's a more innovative approach. Thank you.
Right, and also a lot of school systems will do direct mailings once or twice per year, just a newsletter, and being able to highlight any planning efforts you may have down the road in those newsletters is also just another avenue to be able to hit people that may not be involved in the systems. The other thing another question that we have here, my organization uses Zoom exclusively. Our biggest problem is individuals of poor connection in their home, as we're noticing today and now. That's another tough one. Some advice that I can give you that not a lot of people can necessarily do at home, but if you can physically plug into the internet instead of using wireless, great. If you can use an internet connection versus using a cellular connection, even better. But that's just something that's going to be an issue throughout.
And Scott, we have another hand raised.
Okay.
I'll unmute him. Jeffrey, you're up.
Thank you. Had just to offer another answer to Mr. Palmer there on his question. We've been pretty successful with getting the media to support us. So our city newspaper and the 3 TV stations, they're desperate for any kind of information. And so sometimes we've tried to tie a good news story in with, hey, we're doing this thing at a particular school. And especially with the meals programs that we're delivering here during the summer, or meals programs during the COVID crisis, as well as IT repair buses, Wi-Fi buses. They've just been really good with helping us get the word out that way. And with that word, you might be able to get out to, and we're probably going to be doing something like that for registration for our preschool kids coming into the summer.
Great. Anybody else? Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Anybody else want to raise their hand? Okay. All that being said, if you have any questions as we kind of keep moving, feel free to let me know. Kind of what I want to move on to next is I'd like to try to create a kind of back to school survey. and just kind of use this group to kind of brainstorm some ideas. What are some questions that you'd like your communities to answer that might help you move forward? And my thought is we can kind of make this a universal survey that you can choose to distribute if you want, or if you want to kind of tailor it yourself, we can develop this and finalize the questions and just share it with you via SurveyMonkey, and you can do whatever you want with it. But just trying to get some information from communities that'll help us kind of move forward and try to get back to some semblance of normal. Just some starter questions. What are your feelings about sending your children back to school? What are your expectations of the systems moving forward? How do you feel about social distancing in the classroom? How do you feel about teachers' aides and substitute teachers rotating with fully certified teachers to keep students in school at low ratios? How do you feel about increased taxes to support social distancing? How do you feel about a combination of in-school and virtual learning? I know this is a lot to kind of swallow, but there's just a lot of questions and not a lot of clarity or direction right now. But what's some information that you can, glean from your communities that will help you move forward? Maybe I broke everybody. Have any of you gotten any direction from your governors or anything as far as doing this yet, or is it all just too early? Okay, Matt, looks like you've got your hand up.
Just trying to be good colleagues.
Appreciate it.
Sure. And I think part and parcel with some of those questions has to do with transportation, especially, right? Like just getting the children to the schoolhouse will be its own logistical juggling act. And I see that your questions mostly derive from the what and how, right? I think some of the other questions about in particular, like, when will you know that you're ready to send your child back to school? I think we're seeing different messages from federal, state, and local, and it may be a family by family choice. So it'd be helpful to know, when will they know that they're ready to go back to school? Because we have folks in all sorts of different circumstances.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know, kind of as I've just kind of thought through this, it's a huge question, and I think the first question is, all right, well, how are we going to get the kids to school? How are we going to social distance on buses? And then once you get that question answered, then it kind of goes towards that staffing piece. How are we going to reduce? Essentially, it all comes down to reducing class size. How are we going to reduce class size enough to have social distancing in the classroom, and how are we going to fund it? Okay, now we've got a question coming in here. We are having an after-action committee that is in charge of coming up with questions to reach various stakeholders before making any decisions. This committee is currently in the exploratory phase and will meet next week to compare notes and set objectives before moving forward with composing surveys for different stakeholders. So great, we're ahead of the curve. That's always good to be there. But I think that this is just going to be something that we're going to have to get that feedback and make sure that we have everything kind of fleshed out and laid out correctly before we can go back to anything. Julius, if you choose to include parents on a task force, how should parents be selected to ensure equity? That's a great question. There's a couple different ways that I see a lot of districts kind of put these together. One way is they just kind of do an open application process to see kind of who's interested in serving on a task force, and then going through there and looking at people's interests. It's very important to see that we make sure that we get kind of geographic equity in a school system, you want to make sure that you have people from all sides of the district, all grade levels, participating on these task forces. Another way that we kind of see these laid out is they may be appointed by board members, and generally that'll kind of inherently have kind of equity on the task force. Another piece I like to look at is when we have these task forces, to kind of have those norms up front to make sure that everybody has the well-being of every student in the district kind of in mind as they go through it. And reiterating those norms is important throughout. Matthew, thank you for your participation. We will record this and it'll be posted with all our other webinars as well. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, Jeffrey.
Yeah, sorry to keep hogging the line here. So I just, with that last question from Mr. Monk there, I'm down in Charleston, South Carolina, and we've been very successful with using our principals to identify members of the task forces because they know the equity of their schools, and they've usually picked folks that or nominated folks that are really good participants, that are really engaged and want to be there. And we've really never had anything go wrong with that, going that route. It's kind of like you mentioned, the board, getting a board member to suggest somebody. The principals are even down at the deck plate level and have even a better idea for the folks in their school.
Thank you.
Yep.
Sir, my name is Patricia. I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, any recommendations for whenever you are thinking about creating your participants, any recommendations for people that want to be a part of your community engagement initiatives, but necessarily aren't tech savvy?
So are you talking about like part of a task force, or just somebody who wants to participate in a meeting or something?
Like a task force. Oftentimes when I think about various organizations, especially the faith-based organizations, sometimes they don't want to be digitally connected. So any recommendations for that?
I've found in the last few weeks that people that have not been historically tech savvy have all of a sudden gotten very tech savvy, and beginning to engage. Again, I continue to just leverage those organizations because they, I don't know that they're necessarily going back to their congregations now, but they may, at some point in the near future, but they're also working on ways to be able to engage their community, their congregations and their community members, whether it's, via mass mailing, call tree, something like that. It's not an issue that there's a necessarily the right answer for. There's a lot of different ways that you can approach it. But I think that just leveraging those organizations that have those feelers out in the community is the way to go.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or anything you just would love to know from your community that we can kind of put into a survey to kind of get some conversation started? Are any of these questions scary and you don't think that we should ask them because you don't want to know what the answer is?
Yeah, this is Julius. I think those are the exact questions that we need to be asking as we try to prepare to go back to school, because the community, the families, they're going to want to know, are the buildings that I'm sending my kids back to safe? Do you have a plan educating my child? I think that these questions need to be asked by us or answered by us. I think where we find some difficulty is that there's so much uncertainty that remains about what things are going to look like in August, that it's hard for school districts to try
develop these plans. I know here in North Carolina, we're in phase 1 of reopening, but that's really no different than the stay-at-home order that we were under to begin with. Some of the other things that we're thinking about beyond the virtual learning, if we need to bring students back into the brick and mortar, because if parents have to go to work, you know, school systems are typically the largest daycare providers. I mean, they are what makes society normal. And so if we're bringing them in there, just the mask alone, to be able to provide masks for, in my case, the 30,000+ students and, you know, 6,000 or 7,000 employees on a daily basis, and have a mechanism to test those who are symptomatic, but, you know, I really don't have any way to guarantee that the asymptomatic, you know, students aren't going to have an effect, or even the teachers. But the community will want to know that I got a plan to ensure that safety. And I would like to say I do, but I think that's going to be the largest thing is if not being able to actually do it, at least give people the peace of mind that we're doing all that we can.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think that just comes back to that. What are your expectations of your school system moving forward? I think if we can get some good feedback around that, because I think that everybody's situation is a little different and people have different needs and different expectations. I mean, I'd love to sit here for another hour with y'all, but if you guys don't have any questions or anything else to share, we can kind of start to put this together and draft it and maybe send out to the group before we finalize it. But I hope I could share some useful information. It was great to hear from a lot of you. Any final questions before we kind of cut loose? All right. Well, thanks again. We'll use your feedback to kind of finalize and distribute the survey. What we can do is we can ask participants to indicate which school district that they send their children to, so that we can report the results back to you. Again, if you want to use this, you know, if we start this survey on SurveyMonkey, we can always share it with another survey account. If you want to just kind of take what we develop and run with it with your own SurveyMonkey account, we can share that with you. No issues there. And if you have any ideas for topics for future webinars, please send it to us via the chat function or email. And any comments or questions, just feel free to email me, Leopold@coopstrategies.com. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Thanks everybody for participating, and again, reach out to us if you need any more info. Thank you.